as he passed by a cleaner in a hotel, the millionaire froze upon seeing her earrings, the same ones he had given to his beloved before she disappeared 20 years ago. Arthur gazed absent-mindedly out the large window of his luxurious hotel suite, the Miami skyline stretching out before him. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the city, but his mind wasn't on the view. It hadn't been on much of anything for years. Despite his enormous success as a businessman, a hollow ache had lived within him for as long as he could remember. It was the kind of emptiness that money could never fill, and it had a name: Danielle. 20 years had passed since she vanished from his life without a trace. He had searched for her, tried to make sense of her sudden disappearance, but every lead ended in frustration. The only piece of her he held onto was a pair of earrings he'd given her, a custom-made set with tiny, glistening gemstones. He had never seen anything like them again. That is, until now. As Arthur strolled through the quiet hallways of the hotel on his way to the bar, he was snapped out of his thoughts by a flash of light. A faint sparkle caught his eye. It was small, just a shimmer, but it pulled him in, compelling him to stop. He turned his head and saw a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, pushing a housekeeping cart down the hall. She wore a simple uniform, and her hair was tied back in a loose bun, but it wasn't her appearance that had captured his attention. It was her earrings. His breath caught in his throat. No, it couldn't be. His mind was playing tricks on him. It had to be, but he couldn't look away. The earrings dangled just below her ears, catching the hallway lights in the exact way he remembered. The tiny stones, the unique design. It was impossible. Those were Danielle's earrings. Without thinking, Arthur took a step toward her. His heart raced in his chest, pounding harder than it had in years. Was it possible? Could this young woman know something about Danielle? He cleared his throat, his voice barely steady enough to call out, "Excuse me." The woman stopped and turned, surprised by the sudden interruption. Her expression was cautious, her eyes wide with curiosity as they met his. "Yes, sir," she asked, her voice polite but uncertain. Arthur struggled to find the right words. How could he explain this? He didn't even know where to begin. I noticed your earrings," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Where did you get them?" Her eyes flickered with a mix of confusion and wariness. She reached up, brushing her fingers over the earrings as if she hadn't even realized she was wearing them. They were my mother's," she said simply, her voice growing softer. "She gave them to me a long time ago." "Why?" Arthur's mind raced, his heart hammered in his chest. Her mother? He swallowed hard, his thoughts swirling into a storm of memories and emotions. "Your mother. Does she still have a pair like them?" The woman shook her head slowly, her confusion deepening. "No, these were the only ones, and my mother passed them down to me. They were very special to her." The breath he had been holding escaped him in a rush. What was your mother's name? His voice was barely above a whisper now, as if speaking louder would break the fragile thread of hope forming in his chest. She hesitated for a moment, studying him closely before responding. "Danielle," she said. Her name was Danielle. Arthur's world tilted on its axis. For a brief second, he felt the ground shift beneath him. Danielle? The name he had whispered in his sleep for 2 decades. The woman he had loved and lost? He fought to steady himself. "Danielle," he repeated, his voice cracking with emotion. "That's not a very common name. Did your mother ever mention someone named Arthur?" The woman's expression changed. Her cautious demeanor melted into something more guarded, as if the mention of that name unlocked something in her. She took a small step back, gripping the handle of her cart a little tighter. "Yes," she said quietly. "She did. She talked about an Arthur. A lot, actually." Arthur felt his chest tighten. The world around him seemed to slow down, every sound becoming distant and muffled. Could this really be happening? After all these years, could he have found a piece of the puzzle he had been searching for? "What was your name?" he asked, his voice shaking. The young woman hesitated before answering. "Penny," she said. "My name's Penny." Arthur took a slow, deep breath. Penny. He looked at her again, studying her features more closely. There was something familiar in the shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile, though it was faint. His heart ached with the possibility that Penny could be the daughter of the woman he once loved, the daughter he never knew existed. Arthur stood there, his heart still racing. As Penny looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and hesitation, he struggled to find his composure, the shock of hearing her mother's name, Danielle, reverberating through his thoughts. Could this really be happening? Could Penny be the link to the love he had lost 2 decades ago? He took a step closer, careful not to alarm her. "Penny," he began slowly, choosing his words with caution. "Those earrings, they were very special to me. I gave them to someone a long time ago, someone I cared about deeply." "Your mother, Danielle, does she still have those earrings? I mean, could she have given them to you directly?" Penny's eyes narrowed slightly. The guarded expression on her face deepened, as if she was measuring how much to trust this stranger. She shifted uncomfortably, looking down at the earrings as if trying to recall their significance in her own life. "My mom gave them to me when I was a teenager," she said finally, her voice low and unsure. "She said they were important, but she never talked much about where they came from. Just that they were a gift from someone she once loved." Arthur's heart sank. The weight of the truth was pressing down on him, but he couldn't bring himself to believe it fully. A gift from someone she once loved. That could only mean one thing. The earrings were his. Danielle had worn them the last time he saw her, before she disappeared without a word. And now, here they were, worn by this young woman, her daughter. He swallowed hard, his voice rough when he finally spoke. "I gave those earrings to your mother, before she left. I never saw her again after that. She disappeared. He paused, emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I spent years looking for her. I didn't know what happened to her." Penny's expression softened, but only slightly. There was still a layer of doubt in her eyes, as though she wasn't sure if she could trust him with the full story. "She never told me much about her past," Penny admitted, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the corner of her cleaning cart. "Just that she had to leave, that she didn't have a choice, and that it had something to do with you." Arthur's eyes widened. "With me? She said that?" Penny nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line as she watched him closely. "She said your name once, years ago, but when I asked about you, she wouldn't talk. She always changed the subject. I just assumed, I don't know, that maybe it was a bad breakup or something." Arthur could barely breathe. He felt the weight of 20 years of pain and unanswered questions pressing against his chest. His mind was spinning with possibilities. Why did Danielle leave? Why didn't she tell him? Could it really have been because of him? Or was there something more to the story? He needed answers, and Penny was the only person who could help him find them. "I don't know why she left," Arthur admitted, his voice soft now, almost pleading. "But I loved her, Penny. I never stopped. If there's anything you can tell me, anything at all about where she is or what happened, please, I need to know." Penny hesitated. She was clearly conflicted, caught between her loyalty to her mother's silence and the obvious pain in Arthur's voice. Finally, she sighed, the tension leaving her shoulders. "My mom is sick," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's been sick for a long time. She's bedridden now, but she's still here. She's still alive." Arthur's heart skipped a beat. Danielle was alive. The woman he had mourned for so long, the woman he had convinced himself was gone forever, was still out there, somewhere. He could feel the tears welling up in his eyes, but he blinked them back, trying to stay composed. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Please, I have to see her." Penny bit her lip, looking down at the floor. She didn't answer right away, clearly torn about what to do. After a long, agonizing pause, she finally spoke. "I don't know if that's a good idea," she said softly. "She's not the same person anymore. She's been through a lot. I don't know if she's ready to see anyone from her past." Arthur stepped forward, his tone urgent but gentle. "Penny, please. I've spent 20 years wondering what happened to her. I need to see her. Even if she's not the same, even if she's changed, I need to see her. I need to understand." Penny stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a slow, reluctant nod, she said, "Okay, I'll take you to her, but I can't promise she'll want to talk. She's fragile." Arthur felt a wave of relief wash over him. He was finally going to see Danielle again. After all this time, all the unanswered questions and sleepless nights, he was finally going to get the closure he had been seeking for so long. Penny straightened up, her hand still clutching the cart as if for support. "I finish my shift in a couple of hours. Meet me at the back entrance of the hotel and I'll take you to her." Arthur nodded, his heart still racing, his mind struggling to catch up with everything that had just happened. "Thank you," he said softly. "Thank you, Penny." As she turned to leave, pushing the cart down the hall, Arthur watched her go, the familiar glint of the earrings still catching the light. He had no idea what awaited him, but one thing was certain: his life was about to change forever. Arthur paced the hotel room, his heart pounding as the realization of what was happening slowly sank in. Danielle was alive. The woman he had loved so deeply, the woman who had vanished from his life without a trace, was still out there. Penny had agreed to take him to see her. The thought filled him with equal parts hope and dread. But as much as he wanted to rush to Danielle's side immediately, there was something else tugging at him. Memories that he had long buried. Memories of a time when he and Danielle had been young and in love, full of dreams and possibilities. He sank into the chair by the window, letting the flood of emotions overtake him, taking him back 20 years to when it all began. They had met on a warm spring afternoon. Arthur had been walking through the bustling streets of the city, his mind consumed by the pressures of his family's business. He hadn't noticed her at first. She was just another face in the crowd. But then, she had smiled at him. It was a smile that lit up her entire face, one so full of life and warmth that it stopped him in his tracks. Danielle was nothing like the people in his world. She was free-spirited, spontaneous, and lived life with a kind of reckless abandon that Arthur had never known. She had pulled him out of his rigid, structured existence and shown him a world he had never thought possible. They had spent every waking moment together after that, talking about their dreams, their hopes, and their plans for the future. Arthur had been drawn to her kindness, her infectious laugh, and the way she made him feel like the world was full of endless possibilities. He had never met anyone like her, and he knew from the moment they met that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. He remembered the day he had given her the earrings. It had been a special occasion, though now, thinking back, he couldn't remember exactly what they were celebrating. It didn't matter. What mattered was the look on her face when she saw them. The delicate earrings with their tiny, sparkling stones had been custom-made just for her, a symbol of his love. Danielle had smiled that radiant smile of hers, the one that made his heart feel light, and kissed him softly. She had worn them every day after that, a small but constant reminder of the love they shared. But then, out of nowhere, everything had changed. Arthur's memories of that time were fragmented, blurred by the passage of time and the pain that had followed. He couldn't remember the exact moment he realized something was wrong, but he did remember the growing sense of unease. Danielle had started to act distant, pulling away from him emotionally, though she had never said why. He had tried to ask her, tried to get her to open up, but she had always changed the subject, her eyes clouded with some unspoken fear. And then, One day she was gone. There had been no note, no explanation, just silence. Arthur had come home to an empty apartment, the life they had been building together crumbling around him. He had searched for her, hired private investigators, called every hospital and police station in the city. But it was as if Danielle had vanished from the face of the earth. The only thing she had left behind were the earrings. Arthur ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the memories that clung to him like a heavy fog. For years, he had blamed himself for her disappearance. He had wondered if he had done something wrong, if there was something he could have said or done to keep her from leaving. The pain of losing her had never fully healed, no matter how much time had passed. And now, all these years later, here he was, on the verge of seeing her again. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. What would she say when she saw him? Would she even remember him? What if she didn't want to see him at all? Arthur stood up from the chair, restless and unable to sit still. He glanced at the clock. Penny's shift would be over soon, and he had to be ready. But the memories wouldn't leave him alone. They tugged at him, pulling him back to the man he had been 20 years ago, a man full of hope and love, a man who had thought he had his whole future figured out. But Danielle's disappearance had changed everything. It had hardened him, made him more focused on his career and less on the people around him. In the years that followed, he had built an empire, amassed a fortune, but it had all been hollow. Nothing could replace the hole in his heart that Danielle had left behind. He had tried to move on, of course. There had been other relationships, other women, but none of them had ever compared to Danielle. She had been the one, the only one who had ever truly understood him. And now, after all this time, he was going to see her again. Arthur took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He couldn't let the past control him, not now. He needed to focus on the present, on what was about to happen. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Penny, too. He had to find out the truth, for both their sakes. The knock on the door startled him. Arthur stood up quickly, his heart racing once more. It was time. The back entrance of the hotel was quieter than Arthur had expected. He stood just outside the door, the humid Miami air settling around him, his heart still thumping in anticipation. He checked his watch for the 100th time. Penny's shift should have ended by now. The wait felt agonizing, but his mind was already racing ahead to what was about to happen. He was going to see Danielle. After all these years, after 2 decades of heartache and questions, he was finally going to have answers. The door creaked open behind him, and Arthur turned quickly. Penny stepped out, her posture tense and her eyes darting around nervously, as if she was still second-guessing her decision to help him. She wasn't dressed in her uniform anymore. Instead, she wore a simple blouse and jeans, her face bare of any makeup. The earrings still dangled from her ears, catching the faint light from the street lamp nearby. "You ready?" she asked, her voice soft but tinged with uncertainty. Arthur nodded, though the truth was, he didn't feel ready at all. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, excitement, fear, regret, and hope all swirling together. But there was no turning back now. He had come too far. Penny led him to a small car parked a few feet away. It wasn't anything like the luxury cars Arthur was used to. It was an older model with a few dents and scratches, but it was well cared for. Penny climbed into the driver's seat, and Arthur slid into the passenger side, the two sitting in silence for a moment. "She doesn't know I'm bringing you," Penny said quietly as she started the engine. "I don't know how she'll react. Like I said, she's not the same as she was." Arthur swallowed the lump in his throat. He had already prepared himself for that possibility, but hearing Penny say it still hit hard. "I understand," he replied softly. "I'm just grateful for the chance to see her." Penny nodded but didn't respond. They drove through the darkened streets in silence, the sound of the car's engine humming steadily. Arthur glanced out the window, watching the city lights blur past, his mind racing with thoughts of what Danielle might say, what she might look like. The last image he had of her was so vivid in his memory. Her youthful face, her bright smile, the way her hair shimmered in the sunlight. He wondered if she still looked anything like that woman. After what felt like an eternity, Penny turned down a narrow, quiet street lined with modest houses. She parked the car in front of a small, unassuming home with peeling paint and a tiny garden out front. Arthur's heart sank. This was where Danielle had been living all these years. It seemed so far from the life they had once envisioned together. "This is it," Penny said, turning off the engine and looking over at him. "She's inside. But like I said, she's not well. She doesn't get out of bed anymore." Arthur took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He hadn't expected this. He had imagined her somewhere else, somewhere livelier, more fitting to the woman he had once known. But this was reality. "Thank you for bringing me here," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you for this." Penny shook her head. "You don't have to. I just hope this doesn't hurt her more. She's been through a lot." Arthur nodded, feeling the weight of those words. He couldn't begin to imagine what Danielle had been through, what had driven her to leave and stay away all this time. But now, standing on the threshold of seeing her again, he wasn't sure he was ready for the truth. Yet, he had no choice but to face it. They walked up to the front door together. Penny hesitated for a moment before unlocking it and stepping inside. The house was dimly lit, and the air felt heavy with stillness. Arthur could hear the faint hum of a fan from another room, and the quiet ticking of a clock on the wall. It felt like time had slowed down in this place, as if the world outside had forgotten it existed. "She's in here," Penny whispered, gesturing toward a door at the end of the hallway. "I'll give you a minute. Just take it slow. She gets overwhelmed easily." Arthur nodded, his throat tight. He walked down the hallway, his footsteps soft on the worn carpet, his heart pounding with every step. When he reached the door, he hesitated, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the handle. He paused, taking a deep breath before finally pushing the door open. The room was small and sparsely furnished. There was a single window with the blinds half drawn, letting in a faint sliver of moonlight. And there, lying in the bed, was Danielle. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. She looked so different, and yet, it was still her. Her hair, once full and vibrant, was now thin and streaked with gray. Her face, once so full of life, was gaunt, her skin pale and fragile. But her eyes, those eyes he had fallen in love with all those years ago, were still the same. They were closed now, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths as she slept. He took a step closer, his heart aching at the sight of her. This was the woman he had loved with every fiber of his being, the woman who had disappeared from his life and left a void he had never been able to fill. "Danielle," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He hadn't spoken her name in so long, but saying it now felt like a balm to his soul. Her eyes fluttered open, slowly at first, as if it took all her strength to focus on the figure standing at her bedside. For a moment, there was confusion in her gaze, but then recognition flickered in her eyes, and she gasped softly, "Arthur!" Arthur stood frozen at the doorway, his heart racing as Danielle's frail voice filled the room. Hearing her say his name after so many years was like a jolt to his system. He stepped forward cautiously, unsure of what to say or do. His emotions were swirling inside him, joy, pain, anger, and confusion all mixed together. "Arthur," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper this time, as though she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her eyes, once vibrant, were now tired and sunken, but they still held a flicker of recognition. "Is it really you?" Arthur swallowed hard, nodding slowly as he moved closer to her bedside. He felt a lump in his throat that made it difficult to speak. "Yes, Danielle," he managed, his voice trembling. "It's me." For a long moment, they just stared at each other, both of them overwhelmed by the weight of the years that had passed. Arthur felt a sharp pang in his chest as he took in the sight of her. This was the woman he had once loved with every part of himself. The woman who had disappeared from his life and left a hole that had never healed. Danielle's lips trembled as if she wanted to say something, but no words came. She looked fragile, her body weak and worn from years of illness. Arthur wanted to reach out, to take her hand, but he hesitated. Would she even want that? After all this time, what could he possibly say to make up for the years they had lost? How did you? Danielle's voice faltered, and she coughed weakly, her body shaking with the effort. Arthur instinctively moved forward, gently placing his hand on her arm to steady her. The touch was light, but it was enough to bring back a flood of memories of their time together, of a love that had once felt invincible. "Penny," Arthur said softly, glancing toward the door where Penny stood quietly, watching them. "Penny told me. She brought me here." Danielle's eyes flickered toward her daughter, and a small, sad smile formed on her lips. "She always did have a kind heart," she whispered. "I never wanted to involve her in this. I tried to protect her, just like I tried to protect you." Arthur frowned, confusion spreading through him. "Protect me? Danielle, what happened? Why did you leave? I've spent the last 20 years trying to figure out why you just disappeared. I never understood." Danielle's gaze softened, but there was a deep sadness behind her eyes. "I left because I had no choice," she said, her voice barely audible. "There were things you didn't know, Arthur. Things I couldn't tell you. I was trying to keep you safe." Arthur's brow furrowed. "Safe from what? Danielle, what are you talking about?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering with something, fear, regret, perhaps both. "Your family," she said finally, her voice cracking with emotion. "Your father, he didn't want us to be together. He made sure I understood that." Arthur felt like he had been punched in the gut. His father? What could he have possibly done to force Danielle to leave like that? "My father?" he asked, shaking his head in disbelief. "Danielle, I don't understand. What did he do?" Danielle took a deep, shaky breath, her frail body trembling as she struggled to explain. "He came to see me. After we'd been together for a while, he found me. He said that if I didn't leave you, something terrible would happen. He had powerful friends, Arthur. He said he could ruin your life, destroy your career, and hurt the people you cared about. I couldn't let that happen. So, I left." Arthur's mind reeled. His father had done this. The man who had always been so focused on business, on appearances, had gone to such lengths to keep him and Danielle apart. It didn't seem real. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "We could have figured it out together. We could have faced him. You didn't have to go through this alone." Danielle's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head weakly. "I was scared, Arthur. I didn't know what to do. I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting you, but then everything spiraled out of control. I couldn't come back. I was too ashamed." Arthur felt his heart shatter. He had spent so many years blaming himself, wondering what he had done wrong, when all along it had been his father's manipulation that had torn them apart. He clenched his fists, anger bubbling up inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. This wasn't the time for anger. Danielle didn't need that right now. "Danielle, he began, but his words were cut off as she reached out, her thin fingers brushing against his hand. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered, her voice barely audible now. "Not for a single day, but I was afraid. I didn't know how to make it right." Arthur felt tears welling up in his eyes, and he didn't try to stop them. He took her hand in his, holding it gently, afraid of hurting her fragile frame. "I never stopped loving you either," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not for one moment." They sat there in silence for a while, the weight of the years hanging between them. Arthur didn't know how to fix what had been broken, but for the first time in 2 decades, he felt a sense of peace. Danielle was here and she was alive, and despite everything that had happened, they still had this moment. "Penny," Danielle said softly, turning her gaze to her daughter again. "She's your daughter, Arthur. I wanted to tell you, but I couldn't. I'm so sorry." Arthur's breath caught in his throat. He had suspected as much, but hearing the words spoken aloud felt like a punch to the gut. Penny was his daughter. All these years, he had been a father without even knowing it. "I don't know what to say," Arthur whispered, his mind racing. Danielle smiled faintly. "You don't have to say anything. Just promise me you'll take care of her." Arthur squeezed her hand gently. "I will. I promise." The weight of Danielle's words hung in the air, suffocating and overwhelming. Arthur's mind raced, trying to process everything he had just learned. Penny was his daughter. The woman standing quietly at the doorway, watching this fragile reunion unfold, was his child. Their child. It felt like his heart was being squeezed in his chest, a bittersweet mix of joy, regret, and disbelief crashing over him. He looked up at Penny, who was standing still, her expression unreadable. She had been there for every moment of Danielle's illness, carrying the burden of her mother's silence. And now, in this room, the truth was out. Arthur wasn't just some distant connection to her past. He was her father. But what did that mean for either of them? Danielle's breathing was shallow and her energy was fading fast. Arthur could see it in her face. The years of struggle, of secrets, had taken their toll. She was so frail, her body weak and delicate, but her eyes, those same eyes that had captivated him all those years ago, were pleading with him. "She needs you, Arthur," Danielle whispered, her voice weak but filled with urgency. "I wasn't able to give her everything she deserved. I tried my best, but I couldn't. I couldn't do it alone." Arthur felt his throat tighten. The guilt weighed heavy on his heart. Penny had grown up without knowing her father, without knowing the truth of why Danielle had disappeared. And all this time, Arthur had been living in a world of privilege and success, while Penny and Danielle had struggled. "I'll take care of her," Arthur promised, his voice trembling with emotion. "I'll make up for lost time. I'll be there for her." Danielle's eyes softened, a faint smile crossing her lips as she relaxed slightly against the pillows. She looked so small and fragile in that bed, and Arthur couldn't help but feel a deep ache in his chest. He had spent so many years searching for answers, and now that he had them, it felt like time was slipping away faster than he could grasp. "Penny," Danielle called softly, her voice barely more than a whisper now. "Come here, sweetheart." Penny hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room, her expression still guarded. She approached her mother's bedside, her eyes darting between Danielle and Arthur, unsure of how to process what had just been revealed. Arthur watched her carefully, his heart aching at the sight of her. She had the same look in her eyes that Danielle used to have, strong, but also vulnerable. He couldn't imagine the weight of the secrets she had carried for so long. Danielle reached out weakly, and Penny took her hand, kneeling by the bed. "I'm sorry, my love," Danielle whispered, her eyes filled with tears. "I wanted to protect you, but I should have told you the truth sooner. You deserved to know." Penny shook her head, blinking back her own tears. "You did what you thought was right, Mom," she said softly. "I'm not mad at you. I don't know how to feel about all this." Arthur knelt beside them, wanting to offer some kind of comfort but unsure of how. His mind was still reeling from the realization that Penny was his daughter. His daughter. The words echoed in his mind, and he felt a surge of love and protectiveness for her, though he barely knew her. "Penny," Arthur said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "I know this is a lot to take in, and I can't imagine how hard this has been for you, but I want you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Penny glanced up at him, her eyes searching his face for something. Maybe sincerity, maybe understanding. She bit her lip, looking torn between wanting to believe him and the reality of the years they had been apart. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice soft. "I didn't even know you existed until today. And now, you're my dad. It doesn't feel real." Arthur nodded, his heart heavy. "I know. It doesn't feel real to me either. But I want to make things right. I know I can't undo the past, but maybe we can start fresh. Together." Penny looked at him for a long moment, her expression softening just a little. "Maybe," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Danielle's breathing grew more labored, and Arthur and Penny both turned their attention back to her. She looked so tired, her body visibly giving in to the weight of the years and the illness that had ravaged her. Arthur felt his heart break a little more with each shallow breath she took. "Arthur," Danielle said, her voice a strained whisper, "I need you to promise me something." Arthur leaned in closer, his throat tight with emotion. "Anything," he whispered. "Take care of her," Danielle said, her eyes flickering between him and Penny. "She's all I have left. She's everything." Arthur nodded, his voice cracking as he spoke. "I will. I promise." Danielle gave a weak smile, her eyes filled with love and relief. She closed her eyes, her hand still holding Penny's, and a peaceful silence settled over the room. Arthur watched as her breathing slowed, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion of a lifetime of secrets and heartache. Penny's grip tightened on her mother's hand, her tears spilling freely now. Arthur reached out, placing a gentle hand on Penny's shoulder, unsure of what else to do. There were no words that could ease the pain of what was happening, no way to fix the years that had been lost. They stayed there in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Arthur's heart ached with the knowledge that he had found Danielle only to lose her again, but there was a strange sense of peace in knowing that they had shared this final moment together. As the quiet deepened, Arthur felt a new resolve settle within him. He had made a promise, to Danielle and to himself. No matter how complicated things were, no matter how much time had been lost, he was going to be there for Penny. He was going to be the father she had never known, and he was going to do everything in his power to make sure she never felt alone again. Arthur sat alone in the small living room of Danielle's house. The room was quiet now, the kind of heavy silence that comes after loss. Penny had retreated to her room, needing time alone to process everything. He understood. He needed time, too. Time to think, to reflect, to try and make sense of the whirlwind of emotions that had overtaken him in the past few hours. Danielle was gone. After all these years of wondering, of aching for answers, he had found her, only to lose her again in a matter of hours. The weight of that reality pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. His chest tightened with a mixture of grief, guilt, and anger. Anger at his father, who had orchestrated the cruel separation between them. Guilt for not knowing, for not being there. And grief for the love that had slipped away, for the family that could have been. Arthur leaned forward, resting his head in his hands as the memories of his time with Danielle washed over him. He thought back to when they were young and in love, when the world had seemed full of endless possibilities. He had been so certain that their future was bright. And then, in the blink of an eye, everything had been taken from him. The thought of his father's involvement twisted a knife in his heart. How could his father have done this? How could he have torn them apart so ruthlessly? He thought of Danielle's final words, her plea for him to take care of Penny. That was his focus now. He had made a promise, and he was determined to keep it. But how? How could he begin to make up for all the years that had been stolen from them? How could he suddenly step into the role of father to a woman who had grown up without him, who had no idea he even existed until a few hours ago? Arthur knew he had to tread carefully. Penny was grieving the loss of her mother, and she was still trying to process the fact that Arthur was her father. It wasn't going to be easy to build a relationship with her, not after all the pain and secrets, but he was willing to do whatever it took. His mind raced back to the man he had become over the past 20 years. He had thrown himself into his work, building a business empire, amassing wealth, and surrounding himself with the material success that his father had always valued. But none of it had ever filled the void that Danielle had left behind. He had tried to convince himself that he was content, that success and money were enough to give him purpose. But now, sitting in the quiet of this small house, surrounded by the remnants of the life Danielle and Penny had built, it all felt so hollow. Arthur looked around the room, taking in the modest furniture, the simple decor. This wasn't the world of luxury and power he had become accustomed to, but in a strange way, it felt more real than anything he had experienced in years. This was a home filled with love and memories, things that no amount of money could buy. He stood up, walking slowly over to a small bookshelf in the corner. His fingers brushed over the spines of the books, and he smiled faintly at the titles. Most of them were worn, their covers creased and faded from years of use. He pulled one of them out, a classic novel he remembered Danielle mentioning once. He opened it carefully, and to his surprise, a photograph slipped out from between the pages. Arthur picked up the photo, his heart catching in his throat as he looked at the image. It was an old picture of Danielle and Penny. Penny couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, her hair in pigtails, a wide smile on her face. Danielle was kneeling beside her, her arm wrapped around her daughter, her face beaming with pride and joy. They looked so happy, so content, and Arthur felt a pang of regret in his chest. This was the life he had missed out on. He stared at the photo for a long time, the weight of his absence pressing heavily on him. He hadn't been there for Penny's childhood, hadn't seen her grow up, hadn't been the father she needed. He had failed her in so many ways, even if it hadn't been his fault. The years they had lost could never be reclaimed, but that didn't mean he couldn't start now. He had to. Arthur tucked the photograph back into the book and returned it to the shelf. His mind was swirling with thoughts, plans, and uncertainties. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to make things right. He had to honor Danielle's memory by being the father Penny needed, the father he had always wanted to be but had never had the chance. The door to Penny's room creaked open, and she stepped out, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She paused when she saw Arthur standing by the bookshelf, her expression guarded. Arthur's heart ached seeing her like this, knowing she was hurting. "Penny," he said gently, not moving from his spot. "I know this is a lot, and I can't imagine how hard this must be for you, but I want you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Penny crossed her arms, looking away for a moment before meeting his gaze. "I don't even know you," she said quietly, her voice strained. "I spent my whole life wondering why my mom never told me about you, and now that I know, I don't know what to feel." Arthur nodded, understanding her confusion and pain. "I can't undo the past," he said softly, "but I want to be part of your life now if you'll let me. I'm not asking for anything right away. Just let me try. Let me make things right." Penny sighed, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked so tired, so worn down from the day's events. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "I don't know how to start." "We'll figure it out," Arthur said, taking a tentative step toward her. "We'll take it one step at a time. I don't expect everything to change overnight, but I'm here for you. Always." Penny looked at him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. There was still uncertainty in her eyes, but there was also a glimmer of hope, as if maybe, just maybe, she was willing to let him in. Arthur lay awake in his hotel room that night, unable to sleep. His mind was a mess of emotions, memories, and new realities he was still struggling to process. The conversation with Penny earlier had been a small step toward something new, something hopeful, but it was just the beginning. Their relationship was fragile, and he knew it would take time to build trust, but that wasn't what was keeping him up. It was the revelation about his father. Danielle's words echoed in his mind, repeating over and over like a relentless drumbeat. Your father didn't want us to be together. He made sure I understood that. Arthur still couldn't believe it. His father, the man who had raised him, the man who had molded him into the successful businessman he had become, had been the architect of his greatest pain. Arthur had always known his father was controlling. He had grown up in a world of strict expectations, with his father constantly pushing him to achieve more, to be more, to represent the family name with power and prestige. But he had never imagined that his father would go so far as to destroy his happiness. The next morning, Arthur stood in front of the large windows of his hotel suite, watching the Miami skyline as the sun began to rise. The city below was waking up, but Arthur's mind was still clouded with thoughts of the past. He had to know the truth. He couldn't move forward with Penny or his life until he confronted the man who had taken everything from him. Arthur picked up his phone and made a call to his father's office. It had been a long time since they had spoken directly. Their relationship had become more distant over the years, especially after Arthur had established his own success and didn't need to rely on his father anymore. But now, he needed answers. Good morning, Mr. King, his father's assistant answered cheerfully. Good morning, Arthur said, trying to keep his voice calm. I need to speak with my father. It's urgent. Of course, the assistant replied. Please hold. Arthur's heart raced as he waited, the seconds dragging by. When his father's voice finally came on the line, it was as cold and formal as always. Arthur, his father said, to what do I owe this call? It's been a while. Arthur clenched his jaw, trying to hold back the anger that was building inside him. We need to talk, Dad, about something important, something from the past. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Arthur could almost hear the gears turning in his father's mind, trying to assess what this conversation might be about. I see, his father said finally. Well, I'm a busy man, Arthur. Why don't you just get to the point? Arthur took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the phone. It's about Danielle. There was silence. Arthur pressed on, his voice shaking with emotion. I found her, Dad. I found her after all these years. And I know what you did. I know you forced her to leave. I know you threatened her. More silence. Arthur's heart pounded in his chest as he waited for a response. When his father finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost detached. Arthur, you don't understand. No, Arthur snapped, his voice rising. You don't understand. I loved her. She was everything to me, and you destroyed that. You manipulated her, threatened her. You made her disappear from my life. And for what? So I could focus on the business, on building an empire. His father's voice remained steady, as if he had rehearsed this conversation in his mind 1,000 times. It wasn't personal, Arthur. It was necessary. You were young, reckless. You weren't thinking clearly, and that girl, Danielle, she wasn't part of the plan. She was a distraction. Arthur's chest tightened, his anger boiling over. A distraction. She was the woman I wanted to spend my life with, and you took that from me. I protected you, his father said firmly. I protected our family. That's what this has always been about. Our legacy. Our name. You've built a successful empire because you weren't tied down to someone like her. I gave you a future, Arthur. A future? Arthur repeated bitterly. A future without love, without happiness? Is that what you call protection? His father didn't answer immediately, and when he did, his voice was colder than ever. "You're too emotional, Arthur. You always have been. That's why I did what I had to do. You wouldn't have understood back then, and clearly, you still don't." Arthur felt his stomach turn. The man on the other end of the line wasn't the father he had grown up with. He was a stranger, a man who had sacrificed his son's happiness for the sake of power and control. Arthur's voice shook as he spoke again. "You were wrong, Dad. You ruined everything. I've spent 20 years living with the consequences of your choices, and I won't let you control me anymore. I'm done with you. With all of this." There was a long pause. When his father finally spoke, his tone was icy. "If that's how you feel, Arthur, then so be it. But don't forget who gave you everything you have. Without me, you're nothing." Arthur felt a wave of clarity wash over him. His father's words, meant to wound, only strengthened his resolve. "I don't need you or anything you've given me. You can keep your legacy. I'm done." Without waiting for a response, Arthur ended the call, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The truth was out, and he no longer had to carry the burden of his father's lies. As he stared out over the city, Arthur knew what he had to do. He wasn't going to let his father's manipulation define him anymore. He was going to start over, with Penny, and leave the shadows of his past behind. Arthur sat in his hotel room, his mind still buzzing from the confrontation with his father. The weight of their conversation lingered in the air like a thick fog, but for the first time in his life, he felt a sense of clarity. He had done it. He had cut ties with the man who had manipulated and controlled him for so long. But the relief he expected to feel didn't come immediately. Instead, he was left with a gnawing sense of uncertainty about what came next. The path forward wasn't clear. He had spent the majority of his life under the shadow of his father's influence, building a business empire and living up to the legacy his family had carved out. But now, all of that felt meaningless. His wealth, his success, it had all been tainted by the knowledge that it had come at the cost of his happiness, and at the cost of Danielle's and Penny's lives. Arthur knew he needed to make some hard decisions, but he couldn't do it alone. He needed to talk to Penny. She was at the center of this new chapter in his life, and he needed her to understand what he was trying to do, even if it meant leaving everything behind. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, his heart heavy as he made his way back to Danielle's house. The streets of Miami seemed quieter now, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. When Arthur arrived, Penny was sitting on the porch, her arms wrapped around her knees as she stared out into the distance. The sadness in her eyes was unmistakable, and Arthur's heart ached knowing how much she had been through in such a short time. Losing her mother, learning the truth about her father, it was a lot for anyone to handle. He approached cautiously, not wanting to startle her. "Penny," he said softly, taking a seat next to her on the steps. "I know this has been a lot to take in. I'm sorry for everything, especially for what you and your mom had to go through because of my family." Penny didn't look at him right away. Her gaze remained fixed on the street, her expression distant. "I don't know what to think," she admitted after a long pause. "I spent my whole life thinking my dad was just some random guy who wasn't around. And now, out of nowhere, you're here. And on top of that, I lose my mom." Her voice wavered, but she quickly composed herself. "It's too much." Arthur nodded, understanding her feelings. He knew it wasn't fair to expect her to accept everything right away. "I'm not asking you to have all the answers right now," he said gently. "I just want you to know that I'm here for you, however you need me to be. I want to make things right." Penny finally turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "How do you plan to do that?" she asked, her voice laced with doubt. "You can't just show up and fix everything. It's not that simple." Arthur took a deep breath, knowing that she was right. "I know I can't change the past," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "But I can change what I do going forward. I'm done with my father. I'm done with the business and the legacy that came with it. I want to leave all of that behind and start fresh. I want us to build a life together, one that isn't overshadowed by the mistakes of the past." Penny's eyes widened in surprise. "You're leaving everything, just like that?" Arthur nodded. "Yes. None of it matters anymore. Not without you. Not without family." Penny looked away, clearly struggling to process his words. "You'd really walk away from all that money, all that power?" "I already have," Arthur said quietly. "I cut ties with my father this morning. I told him I didn't want anything to do with him or the empire he built. It's not my future anymore." Penny was silent for a long time, her expression unreadable. Arthur could see the turmoil in her eyes, the confusion, the disbelief, and the weight of the decisions she was now being asked to make. She had lived a simple life, struggling to make ends meet while taking care of her mother, and now, here was a man offering her a new future. A clean slate, but one that came with its own set of challenges. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Penny admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know if I'm ready to trust you." Arthur's heart sank, but he understood. Trust wasn't something that could be built overnight, especially after everything that had happened. "I get it," he said softly. "I'm asking a lot. And I know I haven't earned your trust yet, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove to you that I mean what I say." Penny looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What does starting over even look like?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Arthur thought about that for a moment. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. "It looks like whatever we want it to," he said. "We don't have to follow anyone else's path or live up to anyone else's expectations. We can decide what our future looks like, together." Penny's expression softened slightly, but there was still hesitation in her eyes. "What if I'm not ready to leave this place?" she asked. "This is my home. It's where my mom and I built our life. I don't know if I can just walk away from it all." Arthur reached out, gently placing his hand on hers. "Then we don't have to leave," he said. "We can stay here, or we can go somewhere else. Whatever feels right for you. I'm not asking you to give up anything. I just want to be part of your life, wherever that is." Penny looked down at their hands, her mind clearly racing with thoughts and emotions. After a long pause, she finally nodded. "Okay," she said quietly, "but it's going to take time." Arthur smiled softly, feeling a sense of hope for the first time in what felt like forever. "Time is something we have," he said, "and I'm willing to wait as long as you need." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air, but it wasn't the same heavy silence that had surrounded them before. It was different now, filled with the promise of something new, something that might just grow into the family they both had been missing. The house felt unbearably quiet after Danielle's passing. Even though Arthur had only spent a short amount of time in her presence before she passed, the weight of her absence was heavy. Penny moved through the house in a quiet, mechanical way, packing up small items, sorting through old letters, and carefully tucking away memories in boxes. She hadn't spoken much since their conversation on the porch, and Arthur didn't push her. He could see the grief she was carrying, and he knew better than to rush her through it. Arthur, too, had his own grief to process. He hadn't just lost Danielle again. He had lost the future he had imagined with her all those years ago. But there was something else, too, something that felt like a strange sort of redemption. Danielle had trusted him with Penny, and now that she was gone, Arthur was more determined than ever to honor that trust. He would be there for Penny, no matter what it took. The next few days passed in a blur of quiet moments and small conversations. Penny, though hesitant, had begun to let Arthur into her world little by little. They talked about small things at first, details about her job, memories of her mother, small pieces of her life that Arthur eagerly soaked up. He wanted to know everything about her, to understand the life she had lived without him, and to fill in the gaps that the years had created. But there was still so much left unsaid. So many things that Arthur wanted to say, but he didn't want to overwhelm her. Every time they spoke, he felt the urge to tell her how proud he was of her, how much he wanted to be a part of her life, but he knew he had to be patient. Penny was still grieving, and their relationship was fragile. He couldn't force things. It was on the 4th day after Danielle's passing that Penny finally broke the silence. They were sitting at the small kitchen table, a place that had once been filled with the sounds of Danielle's laughter and Penny's chatter. Now, the only noise was the soft clinking of mugs as they sipped their tea. Penny had been staring at her cup for a while, her face tight with thought, when she finally spoke. "I don't know what to do now," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything feels empty. I don't know how to move forward without her." Arthur set his mug down gently, giving her his full attention. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now," he said softly. "Grief is complicated. It's okay to feel lost for a while." Penny looked at him, her eyes full of pain. "But it's more than that," she admitted. "I feel like I don't know who I am without her. My whole life has been about taking care of her, about being the person she needed me to be. And now she's gone, and I don't know who I'm supposed to be." Arthur's heart ached for her. He understood that feeling all too well, the sense of losing yourself when the person you cared about the most was no longer there. He had felt it when Danielle had disappeared all those years ago, and now he was watching Penny go through it too. "You're still you, Penny," Arthur said gently. "Your mother loved you, and she raised you to be strong and kind and caring. Those things don't go away just because she's gone. You'll always carry a part of her with you. But you also get to figure out who you are beyond that." Penny looked down, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "It's just hard to imagine a life without her," she said softly. "I've been taking care of her for so long. I don't know what else to do." Arthur reached across the table and gently took her hand in his. "You don't have to do it alone anymore," he said quietly. "I'm here. We can figure it out together." Penny's eyes welled with tears, and for a moment, Arthur worried that he had pushed too hard, said too much. But then she squeezed his hand gently, a small but significant gesture that told him she was starting to let him in. "I know," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "It's just going to take time." Arthur nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and hope. "Take all the time you need," he said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." In the days that followed, things began to shift. Slowly, Penny opened up more, letting Arthur into her life in small but meaningful ways. They began to talk more openly about their future, what it might look like, where they might go, and how they would navigate this new chapter together. One morning, as they sat at the kitchen table again, Penny hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice tentative, "about what you said before, about starting over." Arthur looked at her, his heart racing with anticipation. He had waited patiently for her to be ready, and now it seemed like she was. "I'm listening," he said gently. Penny took a deep breath, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the tablecloth. "I don't know if I'm ready to leave this house yet," she admitted. "But I've been thinking, maybe we could do something different, something that honors my mom, but also lets us start fresh." Arthur leaned in slightly, his curiosity piqued. "What do you have in mind?" Penny hesitated again, as if she was still working up the courage to say it. "I've always wanted to help people," she said finally. "And I was thinking, maybe we could use what you have, your resources, your connections, to do something good, something my mom would have been proud of. Maybe we could start some kind of charity or foundation in her name, something that gives back." Arthur's heart swelled with pride. Penny, even in the midst of her grief, was thinking of others, just like Danielle had. "That's a beautiful idea, Penny," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd love to help you make that happen." Penny smiled softly, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "It's a start," she said. "I don't know where it will lead, but it feels right." Arthur nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. This was their chance, his chance, to start over, to build something meaningful together. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But they had time. And for the first time in a long time, Arthur felt like he had something real to look forward to. They sat there in the quiet of the kitchen, a new beginning taking shape between them. Several months had passed since that morning in the kitchen when Penny had shared her idea. Time had not healed all wounds, but it had begun to soften them. Slowly, Arthur and Penny had started to rebuild their lives, side by side, learning how to navigate their new reality as father and daughter. True to their plan, they had thrown themselves into creating something that honored Danielle's memory. The Danielle Foundation, a charity focused on providing care and support for families dealing with terminal illness. Penny's idea had taken root quickly, and Arthur, with his extensive resources and connections, had helped turn her vision into a reality. The foundation's headquarters were set in Miami, a modest but beautiful building that reflected the warmth and compassion that Danielle had embodied throughout her life. The opening ceremony had been a quiet affair, attended by a few close friends and supporters. Penny had insisted on keeping it simple, just the way her mother would have wanted. Arthur watched proudly as Penny spoke at the ceremony, standing in front of a small crowd, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She talked about her mother's strength, about the love and care that had carried them both through difficult times. She spoke about the hope she had for the foundation to help others in similar situations, to provide the kind of support she and her mother had needed. As Penny's speech came to a close, Arthur felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This, he realized, was what his life had been missing all along. Not the business, not the money, not the power, but this, a sense of purpose, of connection. He had found it through Penny, through their shared grief, and now, through their shared mission. After the ceremony, Arthur stood off to the side, watching as Penny spoke to some of the attendees. Her confidence had grown in the past months, and Arthur couldn't help but feel proud of the woman she was becoming. He was still getting used to the idea of being her father, and there were moments when it all felt surreal, but the bond between them was real, and it was getting stronger every day. "Dad?" Penny's voice broke through his thoughts, and Arthur looked up to see her standing in front of him, a soft smile on her face. It still startled him sometimes when she called him Dad. He hadn't expected it to happen so soon. He hadn't expected it to happen at all, really. But one day, out of the blue, she had said it. The first time she called him that, they had both paused, unsure of how to react. But now, the word felt right, like something that had been waiting to be spoken for years. "Yes, Penny?" he asked, smiling back at her. "I was thinking, maybe we could grab dinner together tonight. Just the two of us," she asked, her voice soft but hopeful. Arthur's heart swelled. It was such a simple request, but it meant the world to him. He nodded, his smile widening. "I'd love that." As they walked away from the foundation building, heading toward a nearby restaurant, Arthur felt a sense of peace settle over him. There was still a lot to work through, still a lot of time and trust to build between them. But they were on the right path. They had found their way to each other, and now they were starting a new chapter together. Dinner that night was quiet but comfortable. They talked about everything, about the foundation, about Penny's plans for expanding their reach, and even about Arthur's life before all of this. For the first time in months, they weren't talking about loss or grief or the past. They were talking about the future, and it felt good. As they finished their meal, Penny leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I've been thinking about something," she said slowly. Arthur raised an eyebrow, curious. "What's on your mind?" Penny hesitated for a moment, as if unsure of how to phrase her thoughts. "I think I want to go back to school," she said finally, "to study social work. I want to make sure I'm doing everything I can to help people, just like we're trying to do with the foundation." Arthur's smile widened. "That's an amazing idea, Penny. I think you'd be great at it." Penny smiled back, but there was still a hint of uncertainty in her eyes. I don't want to let you down." Arthur reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "You could never let me down," he said gently. "I'm proud of you. So proud. And whatever you decide to do, I'll support you." Penny's eyes softened and she squeezed his hand. "Thanks, Dad." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the word Dad hanging between them. It wasn't just a title anymore, it was a promise, a bond they were both committed to building. Over the following weeks, Arthur and Penny continued to work on the foundation, expanding its reach and setting up programs to support families in need. They also spent more time together, getting to know each other in ways they hadn't been able to before. Arthur told Penny stories about his youth, about the man he used to be before he lost Danielle, and Penny shared more about her life, about her dreams, and about her memories of her mother. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of tension, moments when old wounds resurfaced, but they faced those moments together. They talked about their fears, their regrets, and their hopes for the future. And through it all, their relationship grew stronger. One evening, as they were sitting together on the porch of Penny's home, their home now, Arthur looked out at the sunset, a peaceful smile on his face. He had finally found what he had been searching for all these years. Not success, not wealth, but something far more valuable: family. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Penny leaned her head on Arthur's shoulder, a quiet contentment between them. "Do you think she's watching over us?" Penny asked softly, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. Arthur wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "I think she is," he said quietly, "and I think she's proud of both of us." Penny smiled softly, her eyes closing as she leaned into her father's embrace. Together, they watched the sunset, knowing that while their journey had been filled with pain and loss, they had found something beautiful in the end: each other,